She gave him a sandwich. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make sense of what that one small act had cost her family, and what it would come to mean for a whole neighborhood. In a glass case on the bookshelf of a high-rise apartment that looked down on a city of cranes and glass, a faded red ribbon lay folded in half, its fibers thinned where a child's fingers had worried them raw. It was the only thing in the room that belonged to the past. Everything else was brushed steel and deliberate geometry. A kitchen island with a single espresso cup left to cool. A leather chair with a crease that had become a map of evenings spent thinking rather than living. A wall of windows where the sunrise looked the same and never quite softened the ache inside him. Isaiah Mitchell turned that ribbon over between thumb and forefinger as if it were a small, stubborn truth. He had sworn, someone had once sworn, words that lived like an echo. "I'll marry you when I'm rich." The memory of the promise was soft around the edges, like a recording played on an old device. It hadn't been a vow. It had been a child's wager, a way to anchor a fear that there was so little to hold on to. But promises given in the gravity of hunger are not easily dismissed. He kept the ribbon because he could not keep the rest of that boy. 10-year-old Isaiah had left a gap in the man he had become, the hollow where a warm sandwich had been pressed into his hands and a small, unassuming girl had expected nothing in return. That gap had shaped him. It had quietly and inwardly set the terms for a life he would spend trying to fill. The first of the lunches happened on a Tuesday that smelled like coal in late August. The chain-link fence around Lincoln Elementary cast a thin grid of shadow across the sidewalk. Isaiah sat on the bottom step of a bench, chin tucked to avoid the wind that kicked up grit and paper. His palms were dirty, not with play but with the kind of grime that came from doing odd jobs wherever they could be found, from carrying groceries upstairs for tips that never added up. The school bell echoed and kids poured out, ball caps, backpacks, the casual arrogance of childhood. Isaiah watched them with an appetite that had more to do with loneliness than with hunger. Victoria Hayes arrived carrying a paper bag that rustled when she walked. She was 3 years his junior by a code of maturity that did not yet belong to her, with braids that clung to her neck and a gaze that scanned the world for what needed to be done. She held out the bag like an offering, and with the uncomplicated decisiveness children have, she sat beside him on the bench and opened it. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a thermos with something warm and a small, trembling apple. "You're not supposed to eat off the fence," she said, with the calm of someone who had already decided to ignore the rule. "But neither are you supposed to look like you're about to melt." He wanted to ask who she was, why she had chosen him, if she knew what it felt like to be invisible. Instead, he took the sandwich. Up close he could smell something homemade, turkey maybe, the faint tang of mustard, the way bread crumbled at the corners. That warmth slid into him, a softening he had not expected. "Mama made extra," she said, as if this explained everything. "We had a little more this week." Her grandmother, who sometimes followed behind with a shopping bag and a slow smile, would later explain how the family measured scarcity and chose where the excess went like a moral calculation. But at 10, Victoria made her own small calculations. She decided without being asked to tilt what little they had toward someone else. There was a ferocity in that kindness that neither of them named then. For Isaiah, it would become a lodestar. For Victoria, it would be simply what was done between the people she loved. For 6 months, the lunches happened with the clockwork certainty of a ritual. Sometimes it was chicken soup, steaming in paper cups that left sugar-etched rings on their palms. Sometimes it was a sandwich wrapped in the same wax paper that smelled like home. Some days the sandwich came with a carrot stick or a small cookie. Some nights the family would read by candlelight and whisper about whether this small generosity could last through winter. The pattern of giving and receiving folded into their days like a secret language. Neighbors noticed and spoke in low, startled voices. "They're feeding that boy again," as if the act needed justification in a world that expected consumption to be privatized. Other children began to ask questions. "Why do you feed him?" one of Victoria's classmates asked, eyebrows arched with the puzzled entitlement of those who had never been hungry. Victoria, with the blunt logic of someone who had learned empathy in practice rather than sermon, said, "Because he is there." The line landed with the surprising force of truth. It was that simple and that insoluble. There were small bruising moments too. Children can be cruel without understanding the cost of their cruelty. Isaiah felt it. The stares, the jokes, a thrown wrapper meant to make him shrink. Once a boy pulled at his sleeve and asked if his mother was one of those, and the word carried a weight Isaiah could not name. But even in pain there was a courage that grew quietly. He learned to look people in the eye, to say nothing, to accept what kindness came without expecting anything more. It was on a late October afternoon, with the trees already stripped of their summer gowns and the schoolyard tossed in the brittle light, that Victoria took the ribbon from her own braids. It had been a ribbon her grandmother saved from a hat or a dress or a holiday, an ordinary token that nevertheless seemed too precious to waste on a child who might forget it in a week. She folded it in half and pressed one side against Isaiah's wrist where he had been fiddling with a loose thread. "Keep it," she said, as if the command were a simple thing. "So you'll know someone remembers." He laughed then, sharp and incredulous. "What if I get rich?" "You'll still be you," she answered straightforward, which is to say she did not imagine that wealth would erase the shape of a person. He grinned, and because children make vows to anchor themselves, he let a promise slip out, a promise that felt equal parts gambit and prayer. "I'll marry you when I'm rich." Her laugh was a sound that would later echo in his memory like birdsong. She tied the other half of the ribbon around his wrist in a clumsy knot. He kept his in his pocket. She tucked her half into a locket beneath her blouse. The gesture was as much about marking each other as it was about the flimsy reassurance of a future neither of them could foresee. The months after that carried the same cadence of small mercies. Sundays meant soup. Wednesdays meant a slice of bread. And on bitter nights, Isaiah could count on the wax paper warmth of another meal. Victoria's grandmother, stern, steady, weathered by years of making ends meet, would sometimes come over with a thermos and murmur that children must be sheltered from more than wind. They must be sheltered from the hardened judgment the world placed on them. "You do what you can, and you teach your children to do the same," she would say. "That's how a town keeps its heart." By the time winter came, the fence had become a border that betrayed a bridge. The school's chain-link divided wood and brick and playgrounds from the hard-scrabble sidewalk, but between the links ran the exchange of food, of small confidences, of the red ribbon. Isaiah learned to name his hunger in ways that were not shame. Victoria learned the exact measure of an apple's sweetness and how a boiled potato could feed two when sliced thin. They made their own economy of care. The end of that year did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic revelation. There was no single night when a light went on and two lives were pivoted. Instead, the end was a series of decisions. A mother passing down less jam to keep an extra bun for someone else's child. A grandfather deciding not to take the bus one week so he could send the fare home. A teacher looking the other way when the boys would slip by late and take their coats. The ribbon remained. The promise was a small, private theater of possibility. Then life pushed forward. People moved, times changed, and promises took shape in ways neither child could have imagined. Isaiah stopped showing up at the fence when the nature of his family's instability altered under the strain of an adult resignation. He moved once, twice, through a pattern all too common in a city that was always shifting. He learned to carry on with what was available. Odd jobs, a steady hand, a resilience that bordered on professional. He learned to keep hunger at bay with whatever currency was at hand. Years later, he would not remember the precise day he stopped expecting to run into Victoria again. He would remember only the small, concentrated certainty that someone had once known his name enough to make space at their table. Time did not unravel them. It simply folded them into different parts of the city's geography. Victoria stayed nearby, shaped by the quiet moral education of a grandmother who refused to let the world teach them cruelty. She went on to study with the kind of economy, part-time classes, overtime hours, scholarship packets, that let someone edge forward without losing touch with where they came from. She became a social worker out of a conviction sharpened by experience, that systems could be built better if the people they served had seats at the table. When she worked late, the smell of disinfectant and the hum of fluorescent lights would follow her home. She learned the ledger of needs, legal forms, medical slips, application deadlines. She learned to paper match reality to policy with a patience that was both practical and weary. She kept the half of the red ribbon in her locket, and sometimes when the elevator cables hummed and the city felt brittle, she would rub the thread between her fingers and remember a boy with empty pockets and earnest eyes. 22 years passed like that, a long, uneven filament stretching from the bench at Lincoln Elementary to a present where both of them had made entire identities out of the consequences of a single season. Isaiah's present had the look of success that the headlines then attached to his name. Mitchell Development, projects with names that sounded like optimism, Harborview Commons, the River Line, and a balance sheet that had opened more doors than it had closed. There was a $47 million valuation whispered in certain financial circles, a tidy sum that felt both obscene and ordinary depending on which side of the window you stood. He had cultivated that fortune the way surgeons cultivate calm, with meticulous planning, the displacement of risk, the reduction of all variables to the kind of certainty that money buys. But the penthouse made a liar of the notion that wealth healed everything. Money replaced 1,000 small answers, but not the questions that had shaped him. It could buy the apartment but not the smell of chicken soup on a November afternoon. It could hire chefs, security, and publicists, but it could not reweave the moral logic that had tied a girl and a boy to one another across time. There were practical traces of the past in his world. The ribbon in a glass frame was the most conspicuous. Beneath it, in a drawer, he kept files, printed maps of neighborhoods, property assessments, the names of supervisors who might recall Lincoln Elementary or the South Chicago Community Center. He had spent 5 years looking, 5 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in investigators' fees, in research assistance, in cold calls that ended with voicemail. He had assembled dossiers, old school directories, yearbook photos, records that rarely told the whole truth. There were nights when the search was methodical and surgical. There were nights when it was an ache without method, a hand pressed to a gap that wouldn't close. The search itself had been a study in both obsession and restraint. Isaiah had learned to parse people the way he parsed investments. What was risk, what was a blind spot, what could be remedied without damage. He hired a lean team to comb through municipal records, to cross-reference names with addresses, to track down alumni lists. He drove through neighborhoods at dusk, windows cracked, scanning for a familiar gate or a braid tossed over a shoulder. He paid for small things that felt bigger than they ought to, a corner store clerk's memory, an archivist's time, a teacher's recollection. He drove to D.C. to subpoena old-school rosters and sat through hours of municipal hearings, watching how bureaucracy guarded itself. And yet no search is only a search. It changes the seeker. Money, he discovered, could open doors and tighten them. When he started buying properties around Lincoln Elementary, vacant lots, a derelict storefront, a small apartment complex that had been a rumor on a community listserv, neighbors eyed him the way people eye strangers who make fast promises. There were late-night phone calls from activists who had their suspicions about developers. "We don't need another gentrifier," someone wrote in a community blog and then in the comments below a local paper's story about a new project. Isaiah read the posts and felt the old shame of being judged by appearance, of being mistrusted. He knew by experience that wealth could be the instrument of erasure if wielded without care. So he did the thing many with resources do. He built a narrative around his intentions. He assembled a presentation, a set of renderings that showed playgrounds and affordable units and a landscaped corridor. He hired community liaisons and drafted a partnership plan. He spoke in a measured voice about sustainability and inclusive development, but he also felt a crookedness inside him, like a man trying to write his own redemption story with a pen that was not his. Some nights in the penthouse he would sit with the ribbon in his palm and imagine a different path. What if that promise from a childhood bench could be honored not as a purchase but as a partnership? If the boy had vowed, in the idiom of the hungry, some form of repayment, what would it be to truly keep it? It had to be more than a headline, more than a plaque. It had to be something that preserved the dignity of those it touched. The real question was not whether he could change lives, but whether he could change systems, without making the people they aimed to help foot the bill for the change. While he wrestled with that, Victoria was moving through a different set of compromises. She had taken the hard route, degrees gained by night classes, internships that paid in symbols and experience, a steady accumulation of credentials. She had come to be something the neighborhood relied on, someone who could navigate the paperwork that made hope legal, that turned promises into vouchers and vouchers into roofs. Her voice could fill a room when she had to. Her laugh was quick and essential when the work got lonely. She kept the ribbon in her locket, and the locket kept the memory of a boy's hand trembling with promise. Now she worked with families, with youths who had aged out of foster care and had no safety net but their wits. She argued for funding in hearings where policy took the shape of clipboards and voices. She had learned to translate a person's life into eligibility categories and to fight back when the categories fit poorly. She knew what a broken system looked like from the inside, and she had the patience to coax it into small incremental repairs. Her leadership had been earned in ways that tried the illusion of easy triumph. She had said no to donors who wanted their names in bronze on an awning, and had said yes to messy pilot programs that did not offer instant metrics. Where others saw numbers, she saw faces. Marcus from the downstairs room who never finished high school but could fix anything. Jasmine who had run away from a house with more fists than explanations. Tyler who had been in and out of shelters since adolescence. She built a practice around making space for people with lived experience at the table. Her insistence grew out of conviction rather than inclination. Those who had been through the system knew its language best. When rumors started circulating that a developer was buying properties near Lincoln Elementary, a worried energy spread through the community. People were wary of developers who promised lifelines and instead left rents to climb and long-term residents to leave. Dorothy Carter, president of the community board and a person who had seen enough development cycles to have a vocabulary of skepticism, reminded people that history mattered. "We've been sold on shiny things before," she said in her measured, almost judicial voice at a monthly meeting. "We will not be sold again." It was in the context of that caution that Isaiah's decision to appear in a meeting was less a grand entrance than an accident of habit and longing. He could have sent a representative. He could have written a statement and left it with a community liaison. Instead, something small and private pushed him out of the penthouse. A rain came down the morning of the South Chicago Community Center meeting, wind shearing at the umbrellas as if trying to read the minds of who stood beneath them. Isaiah watched the city tilt and considered the dissonance of his life. Glass and gutters, terraces and trash. He put on a coat, folded the ribbon into his pocket. He called no one. Part of the impulse was to be anonymous, to see what would happen when a developer sat in the same room as those he might affect. He wanted privately to measure the strain between intention and impact. On the crowded bus he watched faces with the kind of intent that made strangers' eyes flicker away. He thought of the bench and the fence and the way a child's promise had become a question mark to be answered. Somewhere in his chest there was a small, stubborn belief that this could be done right if honest people were at the center of the work. When he walked up the worn steps of the South Chicago Community Center, his shoes scuffed against the concrete, the smell of wet pavement clung to him. He had rehearsed a short, careful speech in his head. A summary of what he proposed, assurances about affordable units, an outline of an advisory board. But before he could say any of it, the room was already a map of histories. Folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle. Flyers were taped to the wall. Parents juggled children on laps. Volunteers shifted from foot to foot. There was the low, persistent murmur that comes from a community that knows how to hold many small things at once. A woman at the front called the meeting to order. She introduced the item on the agenda with the practical bluntness of someone homeschooling hope. Community input on proposed development near Lincoln Elementary. The phrase landed like a pool stone, sending ripples outward. Isaiah found a seat at the back. He could have chosen the front, present a polished plan and calmed the room. Instead, he watched and listened. He had to understand the room before he could claim a voice in it. People rose and spoke, some with carefully prepared comments, others with the rawness of personal stakes. A mother talked about rent increases in nearby blocks. An elderly man talked about the corner store where he had bought his morning paper for 30 years. A young woman with a voice that trembled asked about evictions and displacement. Each comment chipped away at the sleekness of Isaiah's renderings in his mind. He felt the old boy's edges, the one who had learned to look at others for help, reawaken in the man listening to the fears of a room. This was not the kind of audience that would be mollified by glossy plans. There was a history of broken promises and developer-driven displacement that it would take more than railings and bike lanes to overcome. The trust he had hoped to buy with philanthropic gesture was not a currency anyone would spend without verification. Victoria sat at the table of organizers, minutes in front of her and a pen in hand. She scheduled speakers with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to administer chaos. She objected when a comment veered toward personal attack. She deflected with the clarity of someone who had learned that anger and fear demanded attention and a framework. She had seen enough meetings to know that rhetoric could drown out need if not kept honest. When a community member, her name a ripple in Isaiah's memory, spoke of a child who had been moved out of a rental overnight because the landlord had sold to a developer, Victoria's jaw tightened. These were the consequences she had watched all her life. People displaced by decisions made in rooms they were never allowed to enter. Her role had always been to steady the conversation like a keel corrects a tilting ship. Isaiah noted how she commanded the room, not with force but with an unadorned competence that made the rest of the table look smaller. Her voice shaped facts into narratives people could hold. He realized then, in the way recognition comes as a slow light, that the woman at the table was the same girl who had tied half a red ribbon around his wrist. He could have left then. He could have folded his plan into a neat press release and let the rumor of his presence circulate. But the recognition, when it arrived, did not feel like a cinematic reveal. It was a private fracture of the ordinary. He sat very still as his mind catalogued the changes on her face, the line at the corner of her mouth from night shifts or laughter, the steadiness in her hands, the locket at her throat that glinted when she turned, and he felt the years compress. The city around him fell away for an instant, and all that remained was the memory of a wax paper sandwich and a clumsy knot of ribbon. He thought of the promise, like an unfinished sentence. Across the room, Victoria kept the rhythm of the meeting. She shook her head at some notes, she affirmed others, and when they reached the agenda item for new developers, there was a polite but palpable edge to how people prepared to be judged. Isaiah watched her and felt the old pulse of gratitude and apology, and the unfamiliar sting of being the one judged. He stood up then, almost without planning it, and moved toward the microphone. In that instant, the meeting became a court, the room a mirror. The half-formed speech he had practiced dissolved. He thought of the ribbon in his pocket and of a childhood line he had never actually expected to return to. He thought of the idea that perhaps keeping a promise did not look like a ring or a headline, but like a long, sometimes unglamorous investment in how people lived. Before his mouth formed a single line, someone in the audience murmured, "Who's he?" A cautious question. Another voice called, "Don't let them buy us out." The air tightened. Isaiah felt the old shame, the glance that measures worth by coin. He lifted his head and, because the impulse of a childhood debt will sometimes demand attention, he said, "My name is Isaiah Mitchell." He showed his hand where the ribbon was folded in paper, and then history narrowed to a point. At that instant, as he stepped forward, the room shifted. Chairs creaked, phones tilted toward him, and far across the table, a pen paused mid-air over a minute sheet, as another set of eyes flicked up and landed on the name like it had been waiting there for an answer. If this reunion is only the beginning, stay with the story. He had not rehearsed what he would say next. He had not scripted the flood of implications that would follow the first syllable of his introduction. What happened after a child makes a vow and a man tries, 22 years later, to honor it? The answer was not yet clear. But as he stepped toward the center, he felt the weight of both the ribbon and the many hands that had fed a little boy lean into the space between them, waiting to see whether wealth could be honest company to memory. The meeting hummed with the low, expectant noise of a community on the verge of reevaluating its history with those who buy and build. Isaiah cleared his throat and began, not with promises in grand fonts, but with a sentence that was measured and plain, the kind of sentence Victoria would respect. "I'm here to listen," he said, "not to tell you what you need, but to ask how we can do this together." "I'm here to listen," Isaiah said, and the room met the sentence the way it met rain, some absorbed, some deflected, some watching to see what would happen next. People leaned forward in their folding chairs as if proximity might make words truer. The formal part of the meeting continued. Questions about zoning, about traffic. But the tone had changed. Isaiah did not read from his prepared script. He answered questions with the awkward honesty of someone learning how to be accountable in public, admitting gaps in his plan, naming what he did not know. He talked about affordable units, about setting aside a third of new housing for income-qualified residents, about preserving long-term leases for current tenants. He spoke of hiring local contractors. Mostly, he listened. Victoria watched him with a kind of careful curiosity. Recognition had slid across the room earlier like a small current. Now it crackled between them in quieter ways. When community members asked about oversight, she pressed for details rather than speeches. Her questions were practical. How would the affordable units be locked into place? Who would enforce compliance? What were penalties for missed promises? When Isaiah deflected with enthusiasm, she steered him back to specifics. The room responded to that clarity. It is easier to feel heard when someone asks what you actually need, not what looks good on a brochure. After the meeting, when the folding chairs were being stacked and people clustered on the wet stoop under umbrellas, Dorothy Carter approached them both. Her presence felt like a small tribunal. She had a ledger of grievances and a long memory. "If you're serious, Mr. Mitchell," she said, looking him in the eye, "then we'll need more than words. We'll need a plan that survives a change in leadership, an audit, and a city election." Isaiah nodded. "I already thought of that," he said. "I want the money to be useful long after I'm gone. But I don't know how to make that happen without people who know this neighborhood better than I do." Dorothy's lips tightened, then softened. "Then you will listen to those people, and their terms will shape it." Victoria stepped forward. Up close, Isaiah saw the small scar at her wrist where a bicycle chain had once bucked. It was a line he had never known existed. She folded her arms, the way she did when negotiating for a family who couldn't be in the room. "We can make something that lasts," she said. "But we do it our way. Governance must be led by people with lived experience, advisory seats for youth who aged out of foster care, independent auditors, a nonprofit board that can't be overruled by a single donor, and I will not be a figurehead." The conditions stilled the air more than his money ever could. Isaiah took a step back and let them land. He felt, in that moment, a clarity that had sometimes been obscured by the lure of building something flashy. He agreed to every term, and then some. The funds would be routed through a foundation with clear bylaws. Dorothy would chair the first independent oversight committee with 2 rotating seats held by former program participants. Victoria would be named executive director with full hiring authority. Isaiah would be a founding donor and a member of a community advisory council, but his role would be explicitly non-executive. They wrote it down that week in a tiny conference room at a legal aid clinic, the scent of stale coffee lending gravity to signatures. A lawyer read the language aloud, terms about recusal, about grant disbursement schedules, about metrics and transparency dashboards. Isaiah watched Victoria demand language he had not anticipated: mandatory quarterly community hearings, publicly posted audits, and a living wage clause for all staff and contractors. She insisted on a clause that required hiring at least 40% of staff from people with lived experience in the first year. Isaiah signed without theatrics. The ribbon in his pocket felt like a small, secret hinge between past and present. They named it the Red Ribbon Initiative. The first months were an array of small things that mattered: finding a building to house transitional apartments, convincing a lender to back a loan with community land trust covenants, installing washers and dryers in the basement so residents could do laundry instead of rationing quarters. They refurbished a derelict storefront into a community kitchen, where volunteers learned to make huge pots of soup together. Soup, too, to honor the motif that had bound them as children. They set up a scholarship fund that paid for GED prep and community college classes, created a job training partnership with a local tech firm, and opened a counseling center that employed therapists on sliding scale wages. Isaiah's money paid for roofs, but Victoria's voice wrote the rules of who slept under them. Staff meetings were loud and alive. Victoria insisted on starting each with a round where staff shared one small victory and one ongoing worry. It felt ceremonial and humanizing, an attempt to keep the organization tethered to reality. She hired Marcus as a case manager after he completed a GED program funded by an early pilot. Marcus had once been a regular in the shelter down the block. He fixed wiring in the program's first site, when a storm took the electricity, and then talked his way into employment. He carried a practicality in his shoulders and a tendency to light up when someone trusted him with responsibility. Jasmine, who had lived in a cramped motels for years while saving money and surviving an abusive household, joined as a peer outreach coordinator. Tyler, hesitant and guarded from years in and out of systems, agreed to therapy sessions that would eventually show him how to handle a job interview. The first intake interviews were messy. Paperwork that had been installed to make services legible to funders sometimes felt like obstacles to the people who needed services. Victoria made a deliberate choice to simplify forms, to allow oral histories to count for documentation, and to set up outreach teams that went to shelters and laundromats, rather than expecting applicants to find them. Isaiah watched this and learned to value the discomfort of lowering barriers. Not everything worked. The first transitional house had a plumbing failure that flooded a downstairs unit a week before move-in. A contractor overpromised on appliances and underdelivered. A city grant application was delayed by bureaucratic red tape, just when cash flow looked tight. There were nights when checkbooks were opened and closed and the numbers still didn't add up. Victoria slept less, which is to say she slept as someone who knew what was owed to the next person in line. Isaiah learned to take calls at odd hours and to accept that his name might be attached to something that would often be far less neat than his development projects. Community trust did not arrive instantly. A few residents, hardened by previous disappointments, voiced skepticism, rightly so. They remembered announcements that had ended in raised buildings and higher rents. Dorothy, in weekly coffee shop meetings, walked the neighborhood block by block to hear grievances. When an elderly tenant worried about displacement because a landlord had hinted at raising rents, Victoria helped negotiate a lease amendment and found a one-time subsidy so the family would not have to move. These small acts were the slow currency of trust. At the same time, word began to spread. Marcus got a job at a local electrical shop, and a video of his graduation from a GED prep class, shot by a volunteer, circulated on social feeds. Jasmine enrolled in community college, and her mother came to the opening of the community kitchen, crying at the sight of a table heavy with food. Tyler, after months of therapy, completed an interview simulation and landed a temp job with a call center that promised steady hours. These were not miracles. They were increments of stability aggregated through services that finally recognized people as capable of moving forward. The Red Ribbon Initiative posted its first metrics at 6 months. 127 youth served across transitional housing, job training, and scholarships. The number was not the whole story, the faces behind it mattered, but it proved a baseline. The board, led by Dorothy and advised by youth who had been through foster care, demanded a monthly dashboard. Isaiah understood the need for numbers. He had built careers on them. But for Victoria, numbers were always to be read next to narratives. She made sure that each quarterly report included a case vignette alongside the statistics. Media attention came in fits and starts. A local paper ran a human interest piece with a sympathetic headline that focused on community ownership. Days later, a regional outlet ran a more skeptical story about developers and philanthropy. National attention followed when a video clip of Isaiah and Victoria, caught in a candid moment at a soup kitchen, went viral under the hashtag #RedRibbon. The narrative that national outlets tried to attach to the story varied. Some simplified it into a love story of the wealthy savior. Others turned it into a tale of corporate social responsibility. Victoria bristled at exploitative angles. Dorothy insisted on setting the record straight. They responded by inviting reporters to the community center, by publishing audit reports, by ensuring that the voices quoted were those of program participants and the people leading it, not just donors or PR staff. There were political ripples. A city council member saw the initiative as an opportunity to push a citywide youth shelter bill. Testimony at a legislative hearing became part advocacy and part policy demonstration. Victoria testified, her voice steady, as she described the structural barriers that had led to youth falling through safety nets, and Marcus took the podium after her to speak about how job training had changed his trajectory. Their testimonies carried the force of lived experience. The bill passed with amendments crafted by community advocates and city staff who had worked with the Red Ribbon Initiative during the pilot phase. Victory did not feel unambiguously clean. Amendments watered down some language, and some funding lines were moved into competitive grants. But there was movement, and in the messy progress of policy, movement mattered. Scaling brought new complications. Replication in other neighborhoods required sensitivity to local contexts. What worked in South Chicago could not be copy-pasted into another city without adaptation. The Red Ribbon team created a replication playbook that included community audit templates, local hiring recommendations, and governance models that required community leadership at the center. Within 2 years, the initiative reported serving 847 youth across its programs, and partner organizations had adapted its model in 34 cities using the replication playbook and oversight guidelines that guarded against mission drift. Each new city received support from a central foundation office but retained local boards to safeguard community priorities. Inside the organization, scaling meant governance and procedure. Dorothy chaired the Oversight Committee, which met monthly and published minutes. A rotating group of advisory board members, many of them alumni of the program, held veto power on major spending changes. There were legal safeguards, covenants on property titles, donor agreements that restricted fund use to community-identified purposes, and an independent audit firm contracted annually. Isaiah remained on the advisory council. He gave money and spoke at fundraisers but did not make hiring decisions or direct program priorities. Victoria had the authority to hire executive staff and to set programmatic priorities. These rules were explicit. They kept power diffuse. There were harder nights, too. An early staff member was accused of misconduct, and the process that followed tested the organization's commitment to transparency. They convened the oversight panel, brought in independent investigators, and followed a procedure that prioritized survivor support and due process. No one wanted headlines, but they wanted the right outcome. The way they handled the situation reassured many skeptics. The process was imperfect, but it was principled. The people whose lives changed worked in ways that threaded the organization into the fabric of the neighborhood. Marcus started an after-school carpentry program that taught young people trades and proud craftsmanship. Jasmine led a peer support group for survivors of domestic violence, helping to connect mothers to counselors and childcare. Tyler began to co-lead job readiness workshops once he felt steady enough to mentor others. Their stories were small constellations of effort, each one neither wholly rescued nor wholly self-made, but built in community with supports that recognized dignity. As the second anniversary approached, the Red Ribbon Initiative planned a gala to celebrate the impact and to raise funds for a new housing wing. For Victoria, celebrating felt complicated. She did not want the night to become a spectacle focused on Isaiah. The imperative to mark success collided with her instinct to center participants. They compromised. The gala would be both fundraising and testimony-driven, with the majority of the stage given to alumni. Invitations were broad, but they reserved half the floor for community members and alumni, so the hearing of those stories would be live and unmediated. On the evening of the gala, Lincoln Elementary's gymnasium had been transformed. Strings of lights, long tables, and a sound system that carried voices without swallowing them. Red ribbons decorated the centerpieces. The original half of the ribbon, the one in Isaiah's framed case, had been brought down and placed in a small plexiglass box near the stage, so guests could see the frayed fibers that had become a symbol for the initiative. Program participants gave speeches. Marcus spoke about the detail of a GED certificate and the first paycheck he used to buy a proper work boot. Jasmine took the microphone and read a list of names, of women who had found safety in the shelter and gone on to schooling, and the crowd rose in recognition. Isaiah gave a short talk that was stripped of the golden phrases he used in development pitches. He spoke about the bench and the sandwich. He acknowledged, quite publicly, that money alone could not rebuild trust. He thanked the community for holding them accountable. When he turned to Victoria, There was a hush that felt almost ceremonial. She was on stage to give one of the evening's testimonies. She had planned it so. She wanted the program's voice to be center stage, not a private scene. He had rehearsed what would follow in different ways. A short private conversation in a kitchen, a handwritten note, a quiet moment after the applause. What he chose to do was public and deliberate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. The gesture was old-fashioned and risky, but he had chosen the night because it was the night that would make the promise visible to the people who mattered most. The community who had fed him once and then taught him how to be accountable. This started with a sandwich, Isaiah said, voice steady now, and with a promise said without all the prudence of adulthood. This work isn't mine alone, but there is someone who has held the real work together. Victoria, would you marry me? The question landed like a small bell. It was the same words he had once offered as a child, but it now carried an adult weight and the architecture of a negotiated life. Victoria did not answer immediately. She had, some nights before, asked him privately whether the promise he wanted to fulfill would be purely for cameras or rooted in mutual life-building. He had answered then with a list of commitments: legal protections to keep governance independent, an agreement that she would never be beholden to his wealth, a plan for co-parenting of program responsibilities should they marry. She had insisted that marriage must not impair the board's independence. He had agreed. Now at the gala, she looked out over the room, the program alumni, Dorothy with her guarded smile, Marcus wiping his eyes, and then at him. The moment was threaded with their complicated past, the boy and the girl, the promise that had been made when neither knew what life would demand. She saw his hands. She saw beside them the framed ribbon. She thought of how many meals had been shared in the meantime, how many nights had been spent by people who had no guarantee of future comfort. This was not a bargaining chip. It was a vow that had been matured into a life of shared labor. Yes, she said, not rushingly, but with the kind of steadiness that had made her a leader. Yes, but not because of money. Because you kept learning how to do this the right way. The room erupted into applause that felt sincere rather than scripted. Hands clapped, cameras clicked, and somewhere a violinist struck into a soft chord. The engagement was a public affirmation, yes, but it was also an explicit covenant with the community. The promise would unfold within structures that honored accountability. After the applause, the couple stepped into the crowd. Conversations swelled around them. Congratulations threaded with questions about what the next years would look like for the initiative. Isaiah and Victoria moved through them, answering honestly. Yes, the new housing wing would be built with community oversight. No, Isaiah would not be the executive. Yes, advisory seats for alumni would be legally enforceable. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony held on the refurbished playground at Lincoln Elementary. The guest list was compact. Program alumni, staff, Dorothy, neighborhood elders, family members. The ceremony was weatherproofed with a tent and sunlight that felt like an answer. They exchanged vows that balanced romance and work, promises to love, promises to show up at board meetings, promises to prioritize radical transparency. As a symbolic gesture, each guest attached a small red ribbon to the original chain-link fence that framed one side of the playground. The fence slowly bent under the weight of the community's small tokens until it looked less like a barrier and more like a tapestry. On the morning after, Victoria and Isaiah walked the neighborhood with a thermos of coffee and a wrapped sandwich, an old ritual made explicit. They stopped at the bench by the school, the same bench where the exchange had first happened decades before. A young girl sat there eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Her name was Sarah. She was hungry and alone. Victoria sat and spoke with her, then offered an extra thermos and invited Sarah to the community center for school help and hot food. In that simple act, the cycle that had begun with one family's sacrifice continued. The Red Ribbon Initiative's dashboards continued to improve, and yet the leadership refused to treat numbers as the only measure of success. The report at 3 years included hard metrics: jobs placed, housing units stabilized, educational completions, and qualitative reports, stories of reconnection and losses that had been prevented. The official numbers were precise. 127 youth served in the first half year, 847 by the end of 2 years, and replication in 34 cities using red ribbon principles and the playbook the organization had developed. Those figures were posted publicly, accompanied by narratives and the framed ribbon that had become an emblem of both the initial smallness and the grown capacity of the idea. Life together was not a straightforward ascension. The couple balanced public obligations and private compromise. They kept separate office hours. They slept apart on nights when deadlines loomed and convened on Sunday mornings to plan family meals and program priorities. Isaiah learned to be present without centering himself. Victoria negotiated the strain of being both a CEO and someone who needed to be at the soup kitchen on Fridays. They navigated disputes with the same procedural fairness they asked of the organization, bringing hard conversations into public governance when appropriate and keeping their domestic disagreements private when the community did not need to be the arbiter. There was a small pregnancy announced quietly after the second anniversary. The arrival of a child, named Hope by consensus of friends and staff, became a symbol the community treated with cautious joy. It did not transform the program into a family-run enterprise. Contracts and bylaws remained in place, and Dorothy continued to chair the oversight committee with a steady hand. The child was, in a way, less the culmination of a promise than another point in a long chain of care. Years passed in a rhythm of small victories and persistent work. The Red Ribbon Initiative built a new housing wing, set up a legal clinic for young adults who aged out of care, and established a scholarship fund that connected youth to apprenticeships and higher education. Alumni returned as staff, creating a feedback loop that reinforced dignity. Those who had once been clients now designed programs. The initiative published annual transparency reports and hosted national convenings that focused on replication ethics, how to scale without erasing local decision-making. There were occasional setbacks. Funding cycles tightened during economic downturns. A beloved staff member left for another city. A political shift put pressure on municipal support. Each time, the governance structures they had insisted on, independent audit, rotating alumni seats, covenanted land, served as shock absorbers. They bought time to reorganize and to remind donors and partners that effective social work is not dramatic but durable. In neighborhood cafes and laundromats and on the steps of Lincoln Elementary, the story lived in small gestures. A young man graduating from a construction apprenticeship, an older woman who could now afford the funeral of a neighbor because a community fund covered basics, a teenager who never had to couch surf because the transitional housing provided stability. Isaiah and Victoria continued to be present, but they were part of a tapestry of people who made the program more than a benefactor's idea. On an ordinary afternoon, years after the ribbon had been tied and later reframed, Isaiah walked into the community center and found the rack where the red ribbons were stored. Dozens of them, hand-tied by volunteers, by children, by alumni, hung like banners. He took one down, fingers moving over the fabric, and saw the first frayed edge of his original ribbon in the museum's tiny case behind a desk. The symbol hadn't become a shrine. It had become a working tool. He slipped the new ribbon into his pocket and walked out to the bench. A young man sat there, fiddling with a broken keychain. Isaiah recognized the posture of someone balancing embarrassment and hope. He sat down, offered the wrapped sandwich he had tucked into his coat, habit more than plan, and the two exchanged a quiet conversation about jobs and school. The ribbon he had in his pocket he offered verbally. A promise, if you will, to be there in ways that mattered, and to support systems that allowed him to be whole. The man smiled the way Marcus had smiled the first morning he stepped into an apprenticeship, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The program published its impact numbers annually, and those figures were used to inform policy, private donations, and the work of dozens of partner organizations. Each report reiterated the same humility. Numbers show reach, not fullness. Victoria insisted that the website include stories alongside statistics, Marcus's trajectory, Jasmine's small household now made steady by her wages, Tyler's ongoing role as a trainer. They made a point of displaying the original ribbon near the entrance and of inviting visitors to tie a new ribbon to the fence if they pledged to act in some small way. In the end, the promise that began as a child's wager had not become the simple vehicle of romance or rescue. It had been a hinge. It was a thread connecting the smallest domestic kindness to structural change that required steady, often tedious work. Paperwork, audits, community meetings, and the slow forging of trust. Love, in their life together, did not erase the need for governance. It insisted upon it. The rebuilding was neither instantaneous nor purely technical. It was relational, political, and stubbornly practical. At a community meeting some years later, when a new group of young people offered suggestions about improvements to a scholarship program, Victoria listened as she always did. She asked them to shape the application criteria. Dorothy nodded from the back. Marcus, now a program director, sat at the front. Isaiah watched from the side, eyes tracing the faces of a room that had been stitched together by many hands. Near the old chain-link fence, now covered in ribbons, a child, no older than Isaiah had been when he first sat on the bench, pressed his palm to the metal and studied the tangle of fabric. A neighbor, seeing the child's interest, offered a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and an invitation to come inside. The red ribbons fluttered in the wind like small flags marking a place where the economy of care continued to be made. If this moved you, consider learning about or supporting local programs for youth aging out of foster care, or simply offer what you can in your own community. Small acts matter,